A lone woman's defiance silenced a frontier town. Her warning made hardened outlaws pause. And what happened next would become a legend of the Old West. The evening sun cast long shadows across Red Hollow's dusty main street, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Inside the general store, Eliza Thornton methodically counted inventory, her slender fingers moving with practiced precision across rows of canned goods and dry goods. The brass bell above the door chimed softly as the last customer of the day departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Widow Thornton, they called her. A respectable woman who'd lost her husband 2 winters ago. The townsfolk treated her with a gentle sort of pity, the kind reserved for those deemed vulnerable and alone. If only they knew. The peace of her evening routine shattered as hoofbeats thundered down the street. Not the usual steady clip-clop of local riders, but the aggressive gallop of men who owned whatever ground they claimed. The sound made her pause, her hand hovering over a jar of preserved peaches. Through the store's front window, she watched them arrive. 6 riders, their black dusters coated in trail dust, led by a man whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the evening air. Jed the Viper Calloway and his infamous Black Spurs gang. The townspeople scurried inside like mice before cats, doors slamming and shutters drawing closed. Only Eliza remained still, watching as Calloway dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling ominously against the wooden boardwalk. "Evening, ma'am," he drawled, pushing through her door without invitation. "Fine establishment you got here." His eyes, cold as a rattler's, scanned the shelves. "Shame if anything were to happen to it." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "State your business, Mr. Calloway." He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Simple, really. Red Hollow's gonna start paying for protection. Insurance, you might say. And since your store's the heart of commerce here..." He leaned forward, dropping his voice. "You'll be setting the example." "No." The word fell like a hammer blow in the quiet store. Calloway's smile faltered. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Eliza cut him off, her voice carrying a steel edge that made his men shift uneasily. "And my answer is no. Now get out of my store." The outlaw's hand drifted to his gun. "Awfully brave for a widow woman." Eliza's eyes never wavered. "Mr. Calloway, I suggest you look very carefully at who you're threatening. Some windows, when broken, cut back." Something in her tone, in the way she stood completely unafraid, made Calloway pause. For just a moment, doubt flickered across his face. If you love stories of resilience and revenge, hit that subscribe button now. Because this tale of how a widow brought a gang of outlaws to their knees is just beginning. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever stood up to a bully who thought you were an easy target. The next morning, Red Hollow woke to the sound of breaking glass and terrified screams. The Black Spurs were making their point, starting with old Tom Miller's bakery. 2 of Calloway's men dragged the elderly baker into the street, forcing him to watch as they systematically destroyed his livelihood. From her store's upper window, Eliza observed with calculated focus, her fingers drumming a steady rhythm on the windowsill. She noted how the youngest gang member, barely more than a boy, kept looking to Calloway for approval. How their supposed sharpshooter favored his right leg, probably from an old injury. Every detail, every weakness, carefully filed away. Sheriff Harlan Briggs finally emerged from his office, his tin star gleaming dully in the morning sun. His steps were hesitant, his hand nowhere near his gun. "Now, fellas," he called out, voice trembling slightly, "surely we can come to some arrangement." Calloway turned slowly, fixing the lawman with a predator's stare. "Already working on that, Sheriff. Just showing folks what happens when they don't appreciate our generous offer of protection." As the sheriff wilted under Calloway's gaze, Eliza slipped away from the window. In her bedroom, beneath floorboards that hadn't been disturbed in years, lay a heavy wooden chest. Her hands didn't shake as she lifted it out, and didn't hesitate as she worked the lock. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay 2 perfectly maintained Colt revolvers. Their ivory grips were yellowed with age but still smooth as silk. Beside them, a black duster, its leather weathered but supple. And beneath it all, a wanted poster, its edges brown with age and something darker. "Wanted, the Widowmaker," it proclaimed in bold letters. $1,000 reward, dead or alive. The sketch showed a woman in a black duster, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, guns blazing. Eliza traced the image with a finger, memories flooding back. She'd been young then, fierce and terrible, leaving a trail of dead men from Texas to the Dakotas, until she met John Thornton, who showed her another way to live, who taught her that peace didn't mean weakness. But John was gone now, and peace had ridden out of Red Hollow with the Black Spur's arrival. Downtown, the gang's laughter echoed off the buildings as they continued their intimidation. The townspeople were gathering at the church, probably to discuss surrendering to Calloway's demands. They'd take a vote, agree to pay, hope it would be enough. Eliza knew better. Men like Calloway never stopped talking once you showed them weakness. She checked her guns with practiced efficiency, muscle memory replacing years of disuse. Each cylinder turned smooth as butter, each hammer cocked with a satisfying click. The weight of the gun belt around her hips felt like greeting an old friend. "John," she whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry, but I can't let them destroy what we built here." The Widowmaker was about to ride again. As dusk settled over Red Hollow, Calloway gathered his men at the saloon, celebrating their easy victory over the town's spirit. Through the windows, lamplight spilled onto the street, along with rough laughter and drunken boasts. The gang had given the townspeople until sunrise to collect their first payment. "To easy pickings," Calloway raised his glass, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "And to widow women who'll learn their place." His men roared with approval, none noticing the two riders who slipped away from the group, heading toward the creek to relieve themselves. They never made it. The first man fell without a sound, a knife appearing as if by magic in his throat. The second barely had time to reach for his gun before a shadow materialized behind him. "Tell Calloway," a woman's voice whispered in his ear. "The Widowmaker sends her regards." He stumbled back into the saloon 10 minutes later, pale as a ghost, his partner's bloody badge clutched in his trembling hand. The laughter died as he collapsed at Calloway's feet, gasping out his message. "Impossible," one of the gang members muttered. "The Widowmaker? That's just a story mothers tell their children. A woman gunslinger who killed 30 men in 6 months," Calloway finished, his voice suddenly cold sober. "Who took down the Carson brothers single-handedly, who disappeared 5 years ago." He stopped, his face darkening with realization, after taking a bullet meant for a shopkeeper named John Thornton. The saloon fell silent as understanding dawned. Outside, a wind kicked up, rattling the bat-winged doors like hollow laughter. "You're telling me," Snake-Eyed Jenkins, Calloway's second-in-command, sneered, "that quiet little widow running the general store is the same woman who put fear into half the territories? That's horse shit." Calloway's fist slammed onto the table. "Is it? Look at how she stood up to us. No fear, no begging, just that warning." His voice trailed off as he remembered her words about broken windows cutting back. "So what if it is her?" Snake-Eye demanded. "She's still just one woman against all of us." "One woman who just killed Pete and sent Jimmy back with a message," Calloway snarled. "One woman who, if I'm right, has more notches on her guns than this whole gang combined." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. "New plan. Tomorrow we show this town what happens when someone defies the Black Spurs. Burn the livery, shoot some horses, break some bones. Let's see how the mighty Widowmaker handles watching her precious neighbors suffer." But in the shadows of his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty remained. Because if Eliza Thornton really was the Widowmaker, he'd just started a war he wasn't sure he could win. In the darkness outside, Eliza cleaned her knife with methodical precision, listening to the gang's angry shouts. The first blood had been drawn. Now there would be no turning back. Dawn broke over Red Hollow like a bruise, purple and sickly yellow staining the sky. The Black Spurs made good on their threats, descending on the town with calculated cruelty. They started at the livery stable, shooting 2 of Sam Wheeler's prized horses and beating the old stable master when he tried to intervene. By noon, 3 shops had been vandalized, their windows shattered, goods scattered in the muddy street. The gang moved with impunity, their actions growing bolder with each passing hour. They forced Mary Chen to watch as they destroyed her late husband's laundry, soap barrels split open, clean linens trampled in the dirt. "This is your fault," Bernard Miller shouted at Eliza as she stepped out of her store. "If you just paid them like they asked." His face was red with fury and fear, spittle flying from his lips. "Now look at what you've brought down on us." Eliza absorbed their anger silently, watching as her neighbors turned against her. But behind her calm exterior, she was noting every crime, every act of violence. Each one was another bullet in her gun, another reason for what would come next. In her back room, 3 young men waited, sons of farmers who remembered how she'd helped their families during the drought last year. They were scared but determined, willing to fight if someone would show them how. "Watch their patterns," she instructed quietly, spreading a rough map of the town on her counter. "They're cocky now, getting careless. See how they split up to cover more ground? That's their weakness." A commotion outside drew their attention. Snake-Eyed Jenkins was dragging old Reverend Walsh from his church, forcing him to kneel in the street. "Pray for your town, preacher man," he sneered, pressing a gun to the old man's head. "Pray for that widow woman who brought this down on you." The Reverend, his white hair matted with blood from a split lip, lifted his eyes to meet Eliza's gaze across the street. To everyone's surprise, he smiled. "I'll pray," he said clearly, "for the souls of dead men who don't know they're walking." The cryptic response enraged Snake-Eye, who pistol-whipped the Reverend before storming off. As women rushed to help the injured man, a rider appeared at the end of the street, kicking up dust as he approached. He carried a message tied with black ribbon. Eliza didn't need to read it to know what it said. Calloway was coming. The games were over. "Get the Reverend to safety," she instructed her small band of allies. "Then start moving anyone who can't fight out of town. Use the cellars, the mine tunnels, anywhere they won't be found." "What about you?" young Tommy Wheeler asked, his father's blood still staining his shirt. Eliza checked her guns with practiced ease. "I'm going to give Calloway exactly what he's asking for. A legend." As night fell over Red Hollow, Eliza transformed her store into a fortress. Every window was reinforced, every entrance trapped except one. Sugar barrels filled with nails became makeshift explosives. Flour scattered across the floor would reveal any intruder's footsteps. The few townspeople who had chosen to stand with her watched in silent awe as the quiet widow became something else entirely. "The Widowmaker wasn't just a killer," she explained, showing them how to create choke points and firing lanes. "She was a hunter, and hunters understand that preparation is everything." Tommy Wheeler and his friends had spread the word quietly, gathering a small force of those willing to fight. They weren't gunmen, just shopkeepers and farmers. But they had something the Black Spurs didn't: desperate determination to protect their homes. The gang arrived just before midnight, their horses' hooves muffled by sackcloth. Calloway had brought every man he had, nearly 20 riders surrounding the store. They expected resistance. They didn't expect war. The first explosion caught 3 men as they tried to breach the back door, the nail-filled barrel shredding flesh and bone. Before the others could react, shots rang out from multiple windows. Not just the store, but from surrounding buildings where Eliza's allies waited. "It's a trap!" Snake-Eyes shouted, firing blindly at shadows. His next words were cut short as a bullet from Eliza's rifle found his shoulder, spinning him from his horse. Calloway's men scattered for cover, but Eliza had anticipated their movements. Every alley they ducked into had been prepared, every hiding spot covered by at least 2 guns. The gang's superior numbers meant nothing in the chaos she'd created. "Push them toward the church," Eliza commanded, her voice carrying over the gunfire. Right into the firing line she'd established with the Wheeler boys in the bell tower. The night erupted in a symphony of gunshots, screams, and explosions. Eliza moved like a ghost through her store, appearing at different windows, never staying still long enough to become a target. Each shot she fired found its mark with deadly precision. 4 of Calloway's men lay dead or dying before they even understood what was happening. 3 more fell to the townspeople's desperate defense of their homes. The gang's fearsome reputation crumbled in the face of a carefully planned resistance. But Calloway was not a man to be defeated so easily. As his men fell back in disarray, his voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "Burn it! Burn everything! Let's see the Widowmaker shoot through flames!" Oil lamps shattered against buildings, flames leaping hungrily at dry wood. The battle was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not just Eliza's skill with a gun, but her ability to protect the very people who had once shunned her. In the firelight, her shadow danced on the walls like a demon of vengeance. The real fight was just beginning. The flames spread quickly through Red Hollow, transforming the night into a hellish inferno. Buildings that had stood for decades became towering torches, their wooden frames crackling in the intense heat. Calloway's fury had turned the town into a battlefield of fire and shadow. Through the smoke, new riders appeared, mercenaries Calloway had summoned from nearby territories, hard men with dead eyes and quick guns, drawn by the promise of blood money. They didn't care about the town or its people. They only saw targets and profit. "Bring me every man, woman, and child," Calloway's voice boomed over the chaos. "Let's see how long the Widowmaker's courage lasts when she hears their screams." The townspeople, who had fought so bravely moments before, began to waver. Bernard Miller, his face streaked with soot and terror, approached Eliza's position. Maybe if we give you up," he stammered, "they'll let the rest of us live." Eliza didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the street where Calloway's reinforcements were setting up firing positions. She understood their fear. It was one thing to fight back in the heat of the moment, another to face the cold reality of professional killers. The decision was taken out of their hands when a child's scream pierced the night. Through the smoke, they saw young Billy Porter, the blacksmith's son, struggling in the grip of a mercenary. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. "Come on out, Widowmaker," Calloway called, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Or we'll start seeing how many fingers a boy needs to live." Eliza's hands tightened on her guns. She'd known it would come to this. Men like Calloway always went after the innocent when their pride was wounded. She'd seen it before in another town, another life. "You can't give yourself up," Tommy Wheeler whispered urgently. "They'll kill you, then kill us anyway." "No," Eliza replied, her voice calm as she checked her ammunition one last time. "They'll try." She stood, holstering her guns. To everyone's shock, she began walking toward the street, her hands raised. "Let the boy go, Calloway," she called out. "You want the Widowmaker? Come get her." Calloway emerged from the smoke like a demon, his face twisted in triumph. "Finally showing some sense, woman," he sneered. "On your knees." But as Eliza knelt in the dusty street, the ghost of a smile played across her lips. Because while everyone was watching her surrender, no one noticed Tommy Wheeler slipping away with an urgent message, a signal to allies Eliza had positioned long before the battle began. The night was far from over, and the Widowmaker still had cards to play. Eliza stood alone in Calloway's hideout, an abandoned mine office on the outskirts of town. The mercenaries had brought her here, thinking they were leading a broken woman to her execution. They didn't notice how carefully she tracked their route, how she counted their steps and noted every creak in the floorboards. "The famous Widowmaker," Calloway circled her like a vulture, enjoying his moment of triumph. "You know, I heard stories about you years ago. They said you could shoot a playing card edge on at 50 paces. Said you once took down 12 men in a saloon with just 4 bullets." "Most stories are exaggerated," Eliza replied calmly, her eyes tracking his movement. "Maybe," he smirked, "but the bounty on your head wasn't. $1,000 dead or alive. That was real enough. Wonder what it's worth now." Young Billy Porter whimpered from the corner where they'd tied him. Eliza's expression didn't change, but her mind was already mapping out the next few seconds. 3 men by the door, 2 at the windows, Calloway and his new lieutenant between her and the boy. "Let him go," she said evenly. "Your quarrel's with me." Calloway laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "My quarrel's with anyone who defies me, but tell you what, you beg real nice and proper. Maybe I'll let him run home to his mama." "I don't beg," Eliza replied. Then, quick as a rattlesnake, her hands moved. 2 throwing knives, concealed in her sleeves, found homes in the throats of the men by the door. Before their bodies hit the floor, she was moving, rolling toward Calloway's lieutenant. Her shoulder hit his knees as her hand found the knife in his boot, the one they'd missed when searching for her. The blade opened his belly as she came up firing, using his falling body as a shield. His gun, now in her free hand, barked twice. 2 more men fell. Calloway's shot went wide as she ducked behind a desk. The boy screamed as splinters flew. Eliza's response was immediate, 2 rapid shots that forced Calloway to dive for cover, giving her time to reach Billy. "Close your eyes," she whispered, cutting his bonds. Then louder, "Last chance, Calloway. Surrender or die." His answer was another wild shot, but now Eliza had what she wanted, a clear path to her confiscated gun belt hanging mockingly on the wall. The next 30 seconds were a blur of gunfire, breaking glass, and screaming men. When silence finally fell, Eliza stood amid the carnage, both her beloved Colts smoking in her hands. Calloway lay wounded, cursing, his remaining men either dead or fled. "Run home, Billy," she said softly. "Tell your pa the Widowmaker sends her regards." The boy fled into the night as Eliza faced down the bleeding gang leader. But before she could finish him, hoofbeats outside announced new arrivals. The night's dance wasn't over yet. Dawn broke over Red Hollow to find its streets transformed. Where fear had once paralyzed the townspeople, now determination steeled their spines. Word of Eliza's rescue of young Billy Porter spread like wildfire, igniting something that had long laid dormant in their hearts: courage. "She went in there alone," Tommy Wheeler declared to the gathered crowd at the church. "Faced down Calloway and his whole gang to save one boy, while we stood here debating whether to give her up to save ourselves." The shame of their earlier cowardice burned hot in their cheeks. Bernard Miller, who had suggested surrendering Eliza, now stood to address his neighbors. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been wrong from the start. This is our town. It's time we fought for it." Even Sheriff Briggs, who had hidden in his office through most of the violence, found his courage at last. "I wore this star," he said, fingering the badge he'd once dishonored, "promising to protect this town. Today, I mean to keep that promise." Throughout the morning, the town transformed itself into a fortress. Women melted down candlesticks for bullets, while men reinforced buildings and built barricades. Children carried messages and supplies, their small size allowing them to move unnoticed through secret routes between buildings. The Wheeler boys, now battle-hardened from the night's fighting, taught others what Eliza had shown them about creating defensive positions. Old Sam Chen revealed a cache of dynamite he'd kept hidden since his mining days. Every citizen found their role in the coming battle. "Calloway will come with everything he has left," Sheriff Briggs warned as they worked. "He can't afford to let this challenge go unanswered. His reputation among the other gangs depends on it." "Let him come," Mary Chen replied, loading a shotgun with steady hands. "This time we'll be ready." From her position on the church roof, Eliza watched the town's transformation with quiet pride. These weren't trained fighters or hardened gunmen. They were shopkeepers, farmers, and families. But they had found their strength at last. "Your husband would be proud," Reverend Walsh said softly, joining her at her observation post. "John always believed this town had greatness in it. He just didn't live to see it emerge." Eliza nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "He taught me that true strength isn't in how many men you can kill, but in what you're willing to die protecting." Below, the townspeople continued their preparations, each person contributing what they could to the common defense. They had stopped being victims and become warriors, ready to stand together against whatever came. "Riders coming!" Tommy's voice rang out from the bell tower. "At least 30 men, heavily armed." Eliza checked her guns one last time, a quiet smile playing at her lips. The legend of the Widowmaker had started with one woman fighting alone. It would end with an entire town standing as one. Calloway's army emerged from the morning mist like demons from smoke, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. The gang leader's face was twisted with rage, his earlier wound a bloody testament to his humiliation at the Widowmaker's hands. "Burn it!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "Burn every building! Kill anyone who resists!" But Red Hollow was ready. The first wave of attackers hit Sam Chen's dynamite, the explosion throwing horses and riders into chaos. Before the dust could settle, shots rang out from every window and rooftop. The townspeople, no longer afraid, fought with the desperate courage of those protecting their homes. Mary Chen's shotgun roared from the hotel balcony, sweeping 2 riders from their saddles. Bernard Miller, manning a barricade with his sons, picked off anyone who tried to flank their position. Even Sheriff Briggs found his courage, standing in the middle of the street and dropping 3 men with precision shots. "Push them back!" Eliza's voice carried over the chaos as she moved from position to position, directing the defense. Her gun spoke with deadly accuracy, each shot finding its mark. The Widowmaker wasn't just fighting now. She was leading an army. Calloway's men, expecting easy prey, found themselves caught in a killing field. Every avenue of approach had been trapped or covered by overlapping fields of fire. The techniques Eliza had learned hunting outlaws now served to protect the innocent. "They're falling back!" Tommy shouted from his perch in the church tower. "They're regrouping by the creek!" But Eliza knew better. "Watch the alleys!" she warned. "He'll try to split us up!" Sure enough, heavily armed men appeared in the narrow passages between buildings, trying to flank the defenders. But the townspeople had prepared for this too. Rolling barrels of burning oil forced the attackers back into the open, where sharpshooters waited. The battle reached its peak as the sun climbed high. Smoke from burning barricades mixed with gun smoke, creating a haze through which fighters on both sides moved like ghosts. The sound was deafening. Gunfire, screaming horses, the crash of breaking wood, and the occasional earth-shaking explosion. Through it all, Eliza was everywhere at once, a black-clad angel of vengeance. Her accuracy was uncanny, her presence inspiring. Wherever the fighting was thickest, the Widowmaker appeared, turning the tide. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Calloway's voice cut through the chaos. "Fall back! Regroup at the ridge!" The attackers retreated, leaving their dead and wounded behind. But Eliza didn't celebrate. She knew this was just the first wave. Calloway would come again, and next time, he'd come for her personally. "How many did we lose?" she asked Tommy as he climbed down from his post. "None dead," he reported proudly. "Some wounded, but Doc says they'll live." Eliza nodded, reloading her guns with practiced ease. The real test was still to come. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting Red Hollow's battered streets in shades of blood red. After hours of fierce fighting, an eerie silence had fallen over the town. Everyone knew what was coming, the final confrontation between Calloway and the Widowmaker. "You don't have to face him alone," Sheriff Briggs said, his newfound courage evident in his steady voice. "We can end this together." Eliza shook her head, checking her guns one final time. "Some debts can only be settled one-on-one. Besides," she managed a grim smile, "he'd just keep coming otherwise. Men like him can't stand being beaten by a woman." She stepped into the street, her black duster trailing in the dust. The townspeople watched from windows and doorways, holding their breath. This was how legends were born in the West, two killers facing each other as the day died. Calloway appeared at the other end of the street, his wounds bandaged but his pride still bleeding. His remaining men tried to follow, but he waved them back. "This is between me and her," he snarled. The two fighters walked toward each other, stopping 30 paces apart. The setting sun cast their shadows long behind them, like dark giants reaching for each other across the blood-stained earth. "Could have just paid the protection money," Calloway called out, his hand hovering near his gun. "Could have been simple." "Could have picked another town," Eliza replied calmly. "Could have lived longer." Time seemed to slow. A hot wind blew down the street, carrying the smell of gun smoke and death. Someone's shutter creaked. A horse whinnied in the distance. Calloway's draw was fast, legendary fast. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand, the shot cracking out before most eyes could register the movement. But the Widowmaker was faster. She didn't just draw and fire. She drew, dove sideways, and fired twice. Her first bullet knocked Calloway's shot wide, spinning his gun in his hand. Her second found his heart before he could recover. The gang leader looked down at his chest in surprise, then back at Eliza. "Impossible," he whispered. Then he fell dead before he hit the ground. For a moment, no one moved. Then Calloway's remaining men turned their horses and fled, leaving their leader's body in the dust. They'd seen enough to know that some legends were true. Eliza holstered her gun slowly, every movement deliberate. The setting sun caught her face, and for a moment the townspeople saw both women, the quiet widow who ran the general store, and the deadly gunslinger who had saved them all. Sheriff Briggs approached cautiously, staring at Calloway's body. "That's the fastest draw I've ever seen." "Let's hope you never see it again," Eliza replied softly, already turning back toward her store. The Widowmaker's work was done. Now it was time for the widow to return. The days following the battle brought both healing and change to Red Hollow. The physical damage could be repaired, burned buildings rebuilt, broken windows replaced, bullet holes patched. But the town's spirit had been transformed in ways that could never be undone. They buried Calloway and his men in unmarked graves outside town. No one said prayers over them, but neither did anyone celebrate their deaths. Death was a solemn business in the West, even for enemies. Sheriff Briggs, wounded but alive, wore his star with new purpose. The coward who had hidden from trouble was gone, replaced by a man who understood the price of courage. He spent long hours with Eliza, learning everything she could teach him about protecting the town. "Never thought I'd be taking lessons from the Widowmaker herself," he admitted one evening as she showed him how to track riders in the dark. "Still can't believe we never knew who you really were." Eliza's smile was tinged with sadness. John knew. He saw past the legend to the woman beneath, made me believe I could be more than just a killer. The townspeople's attitude toward her had shifted dramatically. The pitying looks they once gave the quiet widow were replaced with a complex mix of respect, gratitude, and, yes, a touch of fear. They had seen what she was capable of, and that knowledge could never be unknown. Bernard Miller, who had once called for surrendering her to Calloway, now greeted her each morning with profound respect. Mary Chen insisted on mending her bullet-riddled duster, though Eliza politely declined. Some things were better left scarred. Young Billy Porter, recovered from his ordeal, had taken to following her around the store, asking endless questions about her adventures. His father didn't discourage it. After all, the boy had seen real evil and survived. Better he learn about courage from someone who understood its cost. But late at night, when the town slept and only the crickets witnessed, Eliza would sit on her back porch and wonder what came next. The Widowmaker's guns had saved Red Hollow, but could she truly go back to being just the Widow Thornton? "You're thinking too hard," Reverend Walsh said one evening, bringing her a cup of coffee. The old preacher had taken to checking on her, understanding better than most the weight she carried. "The town sees me differently now," she replied, staring into the darkness. "They see you more clearly," he corrected gently. "And that's not a bad thing. A person can be both nurturing and fierce, peaceful and powerful, just like this town can be both quiet and strong." Eliza nodded, her hand unconsciously touching the guns she still wore. The Widowmaker would always be part of her, but perhaps that wasn't the burden she'd once thought it was. Perhaps it was simply another facet of who she had become. Red Hollow had changed, and so had she. The only question was what that change would bring next. Spring came to Red Hollow, bringing new life to the battle-scarred town. Fresh paint covered the bullet holes, new glass sparkled in once broken windows, and gardens bloomed where blood had stained the earth. But the changes went deeper than mere appearances. The townspeople walked taller now, meeting each other's eyes with quiet confidence. They had faced the worst that men could bring and emerged stronger. The story of how a widow and her neighbors had defeated the infamous Black Spurs spread across the territories, drawing curious visitors and would-be troublemakers alike. The latter quickly learned that Red Hollow was no easy target. Sheriff Briggs and his newly formed Citizens' Watch, trained by Eliza herself, kept the peace with firm efficiency. The town had found its strength, and it meant to keep it. For Eliza, life settled into a new rhythm. She still ran her store, still kept the books and ordered supplies. But now she also taught shooting classes to the townswomen, showing them that being a lady didn't mean being helpless. The guns beneath her counter were no longer a secret, just as her past was no longer a shame. "You've built something special here," Tommy Wheeler told her one morning as he helped unload supplies. The young man had grown in the months since the battle, carrying himself with the quiet assurance of someone who had faced his fears and won. Before Eliza could respond, the store's bell chimed. A stranger stood in the doorway, trail dust coating his long coat. His eyes moved past Tommy, fixing on Eliza with intentional recognition. "The Widowmaker," he said softly, removing his hat. "They said you'd settled down, but I had to see for myself." Eliza's hands remained steady as she continued stacking cans. "Looking for trouble, stranger?" He shook his head, a faint smile touching his weathered face. "Looking for hope, ma'am. Got word of a town that stood up to Calloway's gang. Though maybe there's still places worth fighting for." Eliza studied him carefully, seeing the weight of years in his eyes. Another gunslinger looking for redemption, just as she had once been. His holster was worn but well-maintained, his stance that of a man who knew how to handle himself. "Red Hollow's always got room for good people," she said finally, "long as they remember that fighting isn't the only way to be strong." The stranger nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. As he turned to leave, he paused. "They say there's more gangs forming up north. The Carson brothers are rebuilding their operation. Might come this way eventually." Eliza's hand brushed the gun at her hip, a gesture more habit now than threat. "Let them come. We'll be ready." The stranger tipped his hat and departed, leaving the door open to the spring breeze. Tommy watched him go, then turned to Eliza. "Will they really come? The Carsons?" "Probably," she replied, resuming her work. "Men like that can't stand knowing there's a place that defies them, a town where people aren't afraid." "And when will they do it?" Eliza smiled, the expression holding both warmth and steel. "Then they'll learn what I learned, that a single person might be a legend, but a united community is unstoppable." Some said the West was dying, that the days of legends were past, but in Red Hollow, they knew better. Sometimes legends don't die, they just find a new way to live. If you thought this story was wild, wait until you see what happens next. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the Widowmaker's tale is far from over.